One day, when the glory comes, it will be ours, it will be ours. Oh, one day, when the war is won, we will be sure, we will be sure. Oh, glory, 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 oh, glory.
The 15th Amendment was ratified in 1870 and sought to protect the voting rights of African American men. However, loopholes were found in this amendment by racist whites. The 15th Amendment did not give blacks the right to vote. It merely stated that the right of citizens to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race. Post-Civil War, there were many methods implemented by white Americans to disenfranchise the black population, which was largely poor and uneducated, having recently been granted their freedom. The most prominent of these methods included poll taxes and literacy tests.
But, since not all white Americans were wealthy and educated, what was known as the Grandfather Clause was passed, stating that any person could vote as long as one of their ancestors had voted before the year 1867. With the 15th Amendment being passed in 1970, no black men had voted before 1867, making clear the motives of the Grandfather Clause to further black suppression.
Despite legally being given the right to vote in 1870 with the 15th Amendment, the voter oppression towards blacks in America through intimidation effectively disenfranchised an upsetting majority of the black population. Women were given the right to vote in 1920 through the 19th Amendment, which thus made black Americans the last to fully gain this protected right through the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
President Johnson was appointed in the wake of JFK's assassination and won re-election in a landslide victory in 1964. He believed that the Voting Rights Act would universally change American life for the better. He announced his intention to pass the Voting Rights Act 8 days after the March on Selma.
Alabama state troopers beat peaceful participants in a Selma to Montgomery march for voting rights with nightsticks, tear gas, and whips after they refused to turn back. Some demonstrators were beaten and bloodied severely, while others fled for their life. The incident was televised across the country.
Johnson called for comprehensive voting rights legislation in the aftermath of the tragedy. On March 15, 1965, President Lyndon B. Johnson delivered a speech to a joint session of Congress in which he detailed the shady ways in which election officials denied African Americans the right to vote.
Generally speaking, Jim Crow laws were any laws that enforced racial segregation in America, post-Civil War, largely during Reconstruction and up through the middle of the 20th century. Whites in America wanted to focus specifically on retaining white supremacy in the electoral process. Going further into what we discussed earlier in the video, methods of disenfranchisement were baked into state legislatures in some instances. In 1890, the Mississippi State Constitution adopted literacy tests and poll taxes for all eligible voters. Literacy tests required that a potential voter had to be able to read and comprehend any section of the state constitution. In the United States, prior to the passage of the 13th Amendment, there were anti-literacy laws prohibiting enslaved people from learning how to read and write. In the census of 1880, it was found that 76% of African Americans in the South were illiterate.
The presence of legislation such as this in the state constitution shows how deeply rooted racial issues are in American government. Alabama congressional delegate John B. Knox voiced the blatant racial prejudice in the mindset of legislators at the time when he said, "Convention's goal is to establish white supremacy in the state within the limits imposed by the federal Constitution." The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was signed into law by President Lyndon B. Johnson. The goal of the act was to overcome some of the challenges that prevented African Americans from exercising their right to vote as guaranteed under the 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution.
The Voting Rights Act of 1965 suspended the use of literacy tests and authorized the appointment of federal examiners who could order the registration of black voters in states and counties where fewer than 50% of the voting age population were registered or had voted in the last presidential election.
In addition to more general national provisions, the Act also contains more specific provisions, such as Section 5, that apply to special jurisdictions. Section 5 prohibits districts from implementing change in voting law without first receiving approval or what is called pre-clearance from the United States Attorney General. This increase of government regulation in the voting process creates a more universalized system.
Provisions have also been added in years following the initial passing of the Voting Rights Act for certain districts to provide language assistance to those in communities where there is a high concentration of citizens who have a low level of proficiency in English in order to aid in the electoral process.
The Voting Rights Act is widely regarded as one of the most radical or far-reaching pieces of civil rights legislation in U.S. history. The Voting Rights Act gave African American voters the ability to challenge voting restrictions and vastly improve voter turnout. In Mississippi alone, voter turnout among black people increased from 6% in 1964 to 59% in 1969.
After the Act's initial success in combating tactics designed to deny minorities access to the polls, the Act became predominantly used as a tool to challenge racial vote dilution. The Act has also been linked to concrete outcomes, such as public goods provisions like public education for areas with higher black population shares and more members of Congress who vote for civil rights-related legislation. Since its passage, the Voting Rights Act has been amended to include other features like the protection of voting rights for non-English speaking American citizens. Unfortunately, there's always been a degree of pushback. The Supreme Court case, Shelby County v. Holder of 2013, struck down the coverage formula used to determine which jurisdictions were subject to the previously discussed Section 5. They deemed it unconstitutional. This virtually made the fifth section of the Act unenforceable.
A revised version of the Act, called the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, was supposed to modernize the Act by strengthening legal protections against discriminatory voting policies. The bill would restore what the Supreme Court struck down in Shelby County, and it adds practice-based coverage, making certain types of discriminatory voting challenges subject to pre-clearance. On August 24, 2021, the U.S. House of Representatives passed the bill by a margin of 219 to 212. However, on November 3, 2021, the bill failed to pass the Senate after failing to get the 60 votes needed to invoke cloture.